Most people know the Holocaust as one of the darkest chapters in human history. The Jewish people themselves call it the Shoah, a Hebrew word meaning catastrophe. The term Holocaust comes from the Greek holocauston, meaning completely burnt. Originally, it described a religious sacrifice, but the Nazis were no priests, and their burning completely wasn't a ritual, it was genocide. This was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence. Hitler's racial ideology demanded the elimination of Jews, Romani people, Slavs, and others considered inferior or a threat to the so-called purity and resources of the German people. Millions perished, not as casualties of war, but as part of a systematic plan to destroy entire communities. Uncontrolled human rage, fear, and ideology led to one of the darkest and most shameful chapters in human history. The atrocity was so immense and brutal that its true scale still feels almost impossible to comprehend and utterly devastating. Today we're going to explore this and other truths about the Holocaust that most people get wrong, because understanding them isn't just about history. It's about remembering, learning, and confronting the consequences of hate. Most people think of the Holocaust as a story of Jews being rounded up and killed in gas chambers. While that is tragically true for many, the reality is far more complex. The International Holocaust Remembrance Day is observed every year on January 27th, chosen because it was on this day in 1945 that Soviet soldiers liberated the prisoners of Auschwitz. For Hitler, the Holocaust was central to his plan for Lebensraum, living space, for Germany. Even as the war turned against the Reich, he forced his generals and army to continue a hopeless fight, because the slower the Wehrmacht retreated, the more time the SS had to carry out mass killings. His ultimate goal? Not 6 million, but around 11 million Jews. Even the 6 million he did destroy became, in his eyes, a source of pride. In the last days before his suicide, Hitler called the purification of Europe from inferior races his greatest political legacy. In his famous speech to the Reichstag on January 30, 1939, also the climax of Der ewige Jude, the eternal Jew, it's clear that ideas of genocide were already taking shape. Hitler openly spoke about the Jews. Europe will not have peace until the Jewish question has been disposed of. The world has sufficient capacity for settlement, but we must finally break away from the notion that a certain percentage of the Jewish people are intended by our dear God to be the parasitic beneficiary of the body and of the productive work of other peoples. The first concentration camps in Germany appeared almost immediately after the Nazis came to power in early 1933. Long before the death factories of 1941, people were already dying from forced labor, harsh conditions, starvation, disease, and executions. But the Nazis didn't limit their crimes to Jews alone. Their targets included Romani people, Slavs, and others deemed undesirable. Shockingly, the first victims of this racial war were often ethnic Germans themselves. From December 1939 to August 1941, around 70,000 patients in German mental institutions were murdered, mostly through gas, lethal injections, or starvation. By the end of the war, another 110,000 patients had been killed, and at least 200,000 German women with severe illnesses were forcibly sterilized, all in the name of racial purity. Jews had already been turned into pariahs and outcasts by the mid-1930s, stripped of their rights, registered, harassed, and in hundreds of thousands expelled from Germany. But mass killings of Jews didn't begin immediately, and even when they did, the rules of the Nazi killing machine were brutally systematic. Once a prisoner could no longer perform hard labor, their death was inevitable. One of the most persistent myths about the Holocaust is the idea that Jews didn't fight back or resist the Nazi terror. In reality, Jewish resistance was widespread and diverse. Across Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe, Jews organized underground movements in over 100 ghettos. These groups sought to resist, to fight, and sometimes to escape, even knowing that the Nazis' retaliation would be swift and brutal. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 1943 became the most famous and largest act of Jewish armed resistance. Armed mainly with smuggled and improvised weapons, the fighters refused to surrender as German troops attempted to destroy the ghetto. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 1943, though heroic and symbolically powerful, ended in devastating defeat for the Jewish fighters. After nearly a month of armed resistance, the heavily outnumbered and poorly armed insurgents were crushed by German forces. The Nazis systematically burned the ghetto to the ground, building by building, and virtually all of the remaining inhabitants were killed or deported to extermination camps. The uprising became a lasting symbol of courage and defiance. It demonstrated that Jews did resist, refusing to submit quietly to annihilation. Similar revolts, smaller in scale but no less determined, erupted in Vilnius, Bialystok, and other cities, where Jews took up arms despite the certainty of death. Resistance extended beyond the ghettos. Thousands of Jews fled to the forests to join partisan units from Poland to Belarus, Lithuania, and Ukraine. These groups not only fought German soldiers but also sabotaged rail lines, disrupted supply routes, and struck at the logistical backbone of the Nazi war machine. Even within the death camps, prisoners staged uprisings. At Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz, inmates gathered what weapons they could find, set fires, and attempted to break through barbed wire in desperate but heroic attempts to escape. Yet resistance was not only physical. Countless Jews fought in subtler ways, acts that required courage of a different sort. They helped others hide, forged documents, smuggled food, and preserved knowledge and culture through secret schools, religious ceremonies, and meticulous documentation of Nazi crimes. To claim that Jews did not resist is to erase these extraordinary acts of defiance, both large and small, that stood as a testament to resilience and hope. Another deeply rooted misconception about the Holocaust is the idea that nobody knew what was happening, that the mass murder of Jews and other victims was a secret hidden from everyone, or discovered only at the end of the war. In fact, knowledge about persecution, deportations, and mass killings was circulating widely among Germans within occupied Europe and among the governments at war with Nazi Germany. In Hitler's Germany itself, the regime controlled information tightly, but the general outlines of anti-Jewish policy were not a complete secret. Nazi propaganda relentlessly dehumanized Jewish people and presented racial purity as a central goal of the state. Laws, public boycotts, and discriminatory measures were visible to ordinary citizens long before the war. By 1943, historians estimate that a substantial portion of the German population, perhaps 1/3 or more, had at least a general sense of mass killings and the regime's brutal policies toward Jews and other undesirables. Many Germans saw columns of prisoners, heard rumors, or understood enough through official and unofficial channels to form a picture of persecution. While exact knowledge of extermination camps varied, it was not entirely unknown. Turning to the Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, the picture is again more complex than the myth suggests. Government intelligence and diplomatic channels received reports about systematic mass murders from escapees, underground movements, and foreign governments in exile. In December 1942, for example, the Allied governments issued a public declaration condemning the cold-blooded extermination of Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe, acknowledging that millions had already been killed and millions more were in danger. These statements show that the scale of the atrocities was understood at high levels well before Allied troops liberated the camps in 1945. At the same time, public emphasis by Allied leaders on the Holocaust was muted and often couched in general denunciations of Nazi brutality rather than specific calls for rescue. Political, military, and logistical priorities, winning the war against Nazi Germany, dominated decision-making. The Soviet Union, too, had access to evidence of Nazi mass murder, especially after the German invasion in 1941. Soviet soldiers and intelligence encountered atrocities committed in occupied Soviet territories, and the regime used reports of German brutality for propaganda to strengthen resistance. Yet, like the Western Allies, Soviet leadership prioritized military defeat of Germany over explicit rescue operations aimed at Jews and other targeted groups. So, while the simple claim that nobody knew is false, The complexity of wartime communication, competing priorities, and political pressures meant that clear, sustained action to stop the genocide was tragically limited. Knowledge existed on many levels, from civilians in Europe to Allied capitals, but understanding did not always translate into intervention. It is a common misconception to think of the Holocaust as a chaotic, senseless explosion of cruelty, as though it were random acts of violence unleashed by deranged individuals. In reality, the Holocaust was an immensely organized, systematic process of destruction, often described as a machine built solely for killing. The Nazi regime meticulously planned every stage: the roundup of Jews, the creation of ghettos where Jewish populations were particularly large, such as the Warsaw Ghetto with nearly 500,000 residents, Lviv with 400,000, and others like Minsk, the confiscation of property, impoverishment, and then deportation to death factories across Poland and other occupied countries. Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, Birch, Mauthausen, Sobibor, Ravensbrück, and thousands of smaller extermination sites formed an intricate network. Very few survived these camps. Those who did often arrived late, endured nearly to the end of the war, and were liberated by Allied forces in 1945. The Holocaust was not confined to camps. Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS death squads, operated in occupied territories, following the German army to identify and annihilate Jews on the spot. They conducted mass shootings without the aid of camps. One such unit, Einsatzgruppe C, under Standkartenführer Paul Blobel, oversaw the murder of over 100,000 people at Babi Yar in Tver between 1941 and 1942. What is most shocking about the Holocaust is the human machinery behind it. The killers were often ordinary-looking people, bureaucrats, clerks, soldiers, who became cogs in the extermination machine. This was the essence of what Hannah Arendt famously called the banality of evil. Yes, some perpetrators were pathological sadists, but the majority, among the 200,000 SS personnel involved, were mentally normal, even seemingly decent citizens in peacetime, capable of living ordinary lives without harming a fly. One such ordinary worker was Adolf Eichmann, who took pride in the efficiency of his role, having sent millions to their deaths. At his trial, he did not deny his deeds, but was genuinely outraged by rumors that he personally killed a 10-year-old Jewish boy, a story the court dismissed as false. Eichmann did not recognize personal brutality as his responsibility. In his mind, the gas chambers represented a merciful method for mass killing. Many others defended themselves similarly, claiming obedience to orders or lack of direct participation. Yet history, regardless of denials by Holocaust deniers, has rendered an unambiguous verdict. The systematic and deliberate nature of these crimes leaves no doubt about their enormity and intentionality. A deeply misleading belief about the Holocaust is the idea that only the strongest or the smartest survived, as if survival was merely a matter of physical prowess or individual cleverness. The truth is far more complex and often heartbreaking. Survival was shaped by a mixture of chance, timing, random decisions, extraordinary help from others, and circumstances beyond the person's control. Life in ghettos and camps was brutal beyond comprehension. Once deported, most Jews faced conditions, starvation, disease, forced labor, and systematic murder that made survival almost impossible. In many places, mere survival till the next day was not a matter of strength or intelligence, but of sheer luck and tiny, often accidental factors. Take the story of Joseph Schleifstein, for example. Born in 1941 in Poland, he was only 4 years old when he arrived at the Buchenwald concentration camp. His father hid him inside a large sack as they were unloaded from the train, and with the help of fellow prisoners, Joseph was kept hidden until liberation by American forces. A survival not due to physical strength or strategy, but to a desperate act of love and improbable luck. Or consider Walter Frankenstein, a German Jew who, with his wife and infant son, survived by going into hiding in Berlin for more than 2 years. They moved from forests to factories, from a brothel to a bunker, constantly avoiding detection. Frankenstein survived not because he was stronger or smarter than others, but because circumstances, timing, and help from others made it possible. Every survivor's story shows how unpredictable survival truly was. Some, like these individuals, owe their lives to hidden identities, aid from non-Jewish neighbors, or chaos at the end of the war. Others escaped death by narrowly missing a deportation or because advancing Allied armies interrupted a transport train. A man named A.B. Isek survived because the train carrying him to Dachau was bombed by Allied forces, a fact of war that saved his life almost by accident. Strengthened intelligence might have helped someone endure forced labor or evade capture for a time, but they were never guarantees of survival. In many cases, survival was sheer coincidence, the way someone was hidden, the moment an army arrived, or an unexpected act of compassion from a stranger. After the defeat of fascism, the world struggled to come to terms with the sheer scale of the horrors that had unfolded. From the very beginning, international organizations, including the United Nations, recognized the vital importance of preserving and passing on the memory of Holocaust victims and the soldiers who liberated them, ensuring that future generations would learn from this dark chapter in human history. The Holocaust has been chronicled in countless books and films, each attempting to capture the unimaginable suffering and resilience of its victims. Among these, Schindler's List stands out as one of the most widely known and impactful portrayals, reminding audiences of both the cruelty of the Nazis and the courage of those who risked everything to save lives. Across the globe, Holocaust museums have been established to preserve this memory. These institutions collect letters, personal belongings, photographs, and official documents, safeguarding the testimonies of survivors and the historical record of atrocities. Exhibitions allow the public to engage directly with this history, fostering understanding, reflection, and empathy. Some of the largest and most well-known museums are located in the United States, Israel, Belgium, Germany, and Russia. Remembering the Holocaust is not just about recalling history. It is about honoring the victims, learning from the past, and ensuring that such a tragedy never happens again. Through memory, education, and vigilance, we confront hate and preserve the humanity that the Nazis sought to destroy.